On this special episode of Shake, Rattle, and Roleplay, you're invited to the wrap party for our recent campaign of Cold City. My name is Bill.
My name is Colin.
And I'm Megan.
We're going to take a look under the hood of a campaign in detail to find out what worked, what didn't, and what tricks you can use in your own games.
All this in a special installment of our regular segment on inspirations. So take a seat at the table.
Grab your dice.
Shake, Rattle, and Roleplay.
So on the special episode of Shake, Rattle, and Roleplay, we're going to be talking about the game that we've been playing on and off the last 15 months, which was Cold City. We started in January of last year. And tonight, as a special guest, we have the GM for that game, our friend Rob. So Rob, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Hi, everybody. Thanks very much for having me on, guys. My name's Rob MacDougall. I am a history professor here at Western, which is the history department here is the home of this spaciously appointed digital history lab in which we are recording right now.
But don't tell anybody.
But exactly.
Well, no, we want to give them credit.
After hours and extracurricular, but no, we're furthering the cause of digital humanities in some unspecified way. And then, of course, I am also a longtime gamer, role player, and yeah, we've been gaming with you guys, maybe 3 or 4 years? More than
longer,
that?
I think 5, maybe.
5 years,
yeah.
Yeah.
Do you remember what the first game you played was?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Like most people of my vintage, I started with Redbox D&D. I played it in the summer. Some older kids who were visiting had it. We played it in the summer that I was maybe 11 or 12. I got it for Christmas. But in the meantime, between the summer and Christmas, it had taken such a hold of me that I basically reverse engineered the whole game and made my sister run through it without the benefit of any rule set or dice or anything, just from memory of how it was supposed to work. So I was obviously hooked, even before I got the set.
So you were GMing right from the beginning? Or
yeah.
DMing, as we said back in the day.
Yeah, other than that one session where I was a dwarf in, Keep on the Borderlands, it hooked me, but right from the start, I was the GM of my childhood group. Played with my older sister, her best friend, the friend's brother, another girl on our street. One of the things that was not super strange about our group, but in retrospect, I think nice, is that it was 3 girls and 2 boys. Later in high school, we'd get segregated by sex, but right off the bat, it was this gender mix group. It was just straight old school, first edition D&D, AD&D at that time. But yeah, I was almost invariably the dungeon master.
What other games have been near and dear to your heart since then?
Well, once we got into high school, branched out a little bit, loved Call of Cthulhu, Paranoia were 2 of our big high school games for my high school group. We kept playing D&D. We played the entire Dragonlance saga all through high school. Then I kind of fell out of gaming when I went to university. Would still occasionally play sort of nostalgic get-togethers with my high school group, but I didn't have an active group in university. When I went to graduate school in Boston, I didn't at first have an active group there. But then maybe 10, really, I guess now 11, 12 years ago, sort of about halfway through grad school, I just suddenly got interested in it again and became aware, thanks to the internet, that there was this really thriving scene. Boston is a university town. There's a zillion graduate students, a zillion university students, and there were a zillion gamers playing a zillion different games. And so I just took it up again, and it was really an explosion of available games. The indie game scene was just sort of happening at that point. The Forge was kind of hitting its stride, and everybody was reading these things. Everybody was on LiveJournal and posting game ideas on LiveJournal, and it was just this kind of crazy churn of, really, there were too many games to play. At any given night, you could have your choice of 3 or 4 games. So I played all sorts of things, and I also spent a lot more time as a player than, which I really hadn't done as much of before. I had always been the designated GM earlier on, but in that Boston scene, there were just too many games and too many game masters to to only be the game master.
So if you were to put yourself on a scale from 1 to 10, 1 being player all the time, 10 being GM all the time, how do you think of yourself?
I guess I'm changing. I guess I'm learning to be a better player. I think that for the first 10 years of my gaming, I would have said, wait, which end was game master?
10 is GM.
10 is GM. For the first, it's like armor class. It used to count up, then it goes down.
We'll probably change this in later episodes and errata it.
Yeah, the next edition will go the other way. Yeah, so for my first 10 years, I would say 9 or 10. Basically, I only GM'd. But now, 5 or 6, and I'm really kind of trying to learn to be a better player because I think my GM chops are better than my player chops, and I'm trying to push myself in being a better player and enjoying that a lot. And it helps, of course, to have you guys. We have great GMs in our group, and so. But yeah, it is a change.
So you said you started off playing D&D and then went into a bunch of indie games. Are there specific games that sort of jump out at you?
Yeah, well, let's see. I guess the games that made a big impression in that first decade of this century, indie explosion, Sorcerer, even though it never worked for me in play, just kind of through the force of his personality and argumentativeness, Ron Edwards kind of worked a change on how I and a lot of people, I think, saw gaming. I know a lot of people don't like him for that, but I think he deserves a lot of credit for kind of creating that scene. Dogs in the Vineyard, Primetime Adventures, Jared Sorensen's games, Inspectors, and Octane, My Life with Master. A lot of these games, just so many. Some of them I've only played once or twice. Some of them, like PTA, Primetime Adventures, I've played quite a bit. But every one kind of expanded my horizons in a different way and sort of showed me, oh, this is something that you can do. This is a different way you can take this.
We keep coming around to the fact that Primetime Adventures is one of our favorite games at this table, and we probably have you to thank for that because you ran us through our very first Primetime Adventures game a few years ago.
Yeah. I think it's a great game, and it was a great game for this group. It seemed to me you guys were almost playing it already. You had latched on to the kind of construct of the episodic TV series as the model, and something that I think you guys, us guys, I shouldn't include myself in that, but you guys were already really good at and really interested in is kind of high drama character interplay, and it's good for that. So it just seemed like a perfect, obvious fit. Yeah. And that PTA game was a lot of fun.
Rob, something I wanted to ask you about, or remind you of anyway. I think in our very first conversation we had at the grad club here at the university years ago, I asked you what kind of games you like. And I'm going to paraphrase here because it was a few years ago and my brain is old and I don't remember exactly what you said, but it was something like, I like games where players' decisions have a significant effect on the outcome. Could you unpack that a little bit for us?
Yeah, sure. That's definitely coming out of those years in Boston and the indie game explosion and that kind of thing. Because if I had to sum up all of what the indie games revealed to me or showed me, it was that idea. And it's not to say that you can't have that in games. It's not that the indie games have a monopoly on that. It's not that it doesn't happen in other games at all. But
it's formalized, certainly, in a lot of story games.
It's formalized, and they really go out of their way. And in fact, before I was talking about Sorcerer and the hostility some people have to Ron Edwards, I think that a lot of those games from the sort of early 2000s are teaching games that in retrospect, maybe people aren't going to need to return to or think about. They were breaking ground, showing people, convincing people. They were almost didactic texts, convincing people to play in a certain way. And that's why some people really don't like them. And it's also why maybe once you get through that, you realize, oh, I can do that in this game, and oh, I can do that in that game. And
I think the other thing is that a lot of that DNA has now kind of spread to a lot of games on the market. Even games that would be considered sort of very mainstream these days have got a lot of that kind of indie game, shared narrative authority business going on under the hood. And a lot of the people that were writing those kinds of small story games, indie games a few years ago, are indeed writing for the bigger developers now. And so there's this kind of cross-pollination happening.
Yeah, absolutely. And I should say that I think there was always that element in these games. Someone from the old school Renaissance would quickly pipe up to say that was always the way it was, and in the early days of the hobby, that was always the way it was. I think some of the games that I mentioned that were my favorite games in the late 80s into the 90s, Call of Cthulhu and Paranoia, as much as I love them, were sort of, they trained you to play a different way. They really did, both those games in different ways, put all the power in the GM's hands and really make the GM work to entertain the players, create the plot, control the story. Again, they don't have to be played that way, but if you look at the modules from those era, the adventures from those era, and certainly when I think about how I played them, it was a lot more GM-driven, GM-controlled. The players were along for the ride for... not completely, but there was that element. There were certainly elements of railroading. Illusionism, I guess, was one of the forged labels for the illusion of choice that doesn't really amount to real choice.
Certainly in the case of Paranoia, it's explicit that the GM is sort of this oppressive authority.
Right.
And it's your job to torment the player.
Yeah.
In a weird way, I've always thought that Paranoia is sort of a parody of GMing generally, in that like you're sort of, it takes the sort of stuff that you would do as a bad GM, and that's what the game's about.
Right, absolutely. That's a great. Sure, it is. It's almost a parody. Right, I have thought of it as a parody of the old dungeon crawls, the levels and the tunnels underground. But you're right. It's really somebody looked at the dysfunctional way that these adolescent boys were playing with one another and codified that and made that the right way to play, and it was genius.
So, Rob, we've already mentioned that our first game with you as GM was a Primetime Adventures game called Them, which was about a group of supervillains that were the heroes of the story for a change.
Lovable supervillains.
Lovable supervillains. Yeah, I really wasn't a very good supervillain, I don't think.
Well, we really resisted.
Or
I think
a very bad one.
I think that you found we really resisted being kind of straight up supervillains.
That's right.
I tried, but my concept of being supervillain henchman didn't really work without a supervillain to latch onto.
Yeah, I've had other groups that would have just sunk their teeth into being villains in a way you guys didn't. But I'm not complaining. I really liked the dynamic that it created, and that game was a lot of fun.
Well, the way the universe twisted around that concept to sort of turn the good guys into the bad guys,
right,
was actually very interesting.
The more you guys wanted to be the good guys, the badder I had to make the opposition, who were actually the good guys, if you can follow me.
Yeah, so the evil corporate superheroes.
The superheroes had to get worse to compensate for you guys really wanting to be the white hats, and you were in the end. Yeah, that game was a lot of fun.
Mm-hmm.
I know we played a few sessions of 316 Carnage Among the Stars after that, but somehow it never stuck with our group. What was your thinking going into that one, and why do you think it didn't work out?
I think that's an ingenious little game. Just really cool and smart and minimalist design that a whole lot of fun interaction can come out of. And it helps that I love that sort of both the kind of war movie Vietnam vibe that it's obviously riffing on, and specifically the sort of Space Marines, Starship Troopers thing that it's coming out of. After Them, I vowed repeatedly that game was way too complicated. It was hard to keep track of all the plot threads. I need to run something simpler, something that is less prep, and so this seemed like just the ticket. And we played maybe 2 times, and it was fun. I enjoyed it. Mm-hmm. But yeah, maybe it was too simple, because then the game we're going to talk about in a minute was not simple in any way. I obviously rebounded in the opposite direction.
Something that was interesting in that game is that I'm not sure if this is the game design or if it's just something you decided to do, but you did tip your hand early about what was actually happening, that we were sort of going out and massacring the galaxy. And I don't know if that was supposed to be the way the game is run, or maybe you felt that as you were running it, once we were aware that that's what we were doing and we could sort of see the layers underneath, that maybe you got the emotional impact about that and then you didn't feel the need to continue.
Yeah, that could be. That's one of the things that makes that game ingenious, is that it's working on more than one level. It is this kind of uncomplicated bug hunt. And then it's also, there's something darker, creepier going on. But that's never laid out.
It's a very light, entertaining game about committing genocide, basically.
Exactly. Yeah. But there's no paragraph in the first 3 pages of the rules that says this is about genocide or this game is going to take this turn. It kind of sneaks up on you just in the little that they tell you about the setting and in the way the rules are set up. I think that were you to play it out, it would inevitably drag you in a really interesting way from this kind of let's go kill bugs, that's fun, to a much darker, deeper place.
Well, I think I fragged a superior officer in like the first episode, or maybe the second.
Sure. I've played the game a couple of times, and every group I've played with frags their officer in the first episode. But what Colin said, it may be that I did tip my hand. When you have a game like that, how do you pitch it to a group of players? How much of that do you want to front load, and how much of that do you want to discover?
Well, it's weird in that it's a role-playing game that kind of has spoilers.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Built into the game system. That.
Yeah.
I mean, I suppose there are examples of games that have that kind of thing built into it, but that game, more than anything else, is...
Yeah.
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 Not to say that I didn't enjoy the game or it didn't work because of that. It's because being aware of those layers actually was interesting. But yeah,
Right. Once we got a little ways, maybe we didn't need to play it all the way out. I don't know. There's another game, Starship Zero. You guys know that one? It's ostensibly a game about a 70s German remake of a 1950s science fiction television series about a spaceship wandering off in space. And it doesn't come right out and say it, but it is also a Lovecraftian game. The game's written by the members of Darkest of the Hillside Thickets, this Canadian Lovecraftian rock band. And I'm not saying it's subtle, but it's funny how the game ostensibly is about one thing, and then, of course, it maintains the fiction that this is a real TV series, which it isn't, but also it claims to be this game of fun action pulp, and yet there's all this bleak Lovecraftian horror sort of mixed in with it. That's a neat idea. I don't know. Maybe these games are better to read than play. It's possible. But I'm really impressed by 316 as an engine, but I think that I said I wanted a simple game, but then I ran back to the sort of complexity and craziness and multi-threaded mystery of Cold City.
I will say that one thing that I thought was quite cool in that is that we did character generation in play in our dropship as we were about to land on the planet, and I thought that was quite cool.
It's such a nice simple system that you can do that. That's right.
Mm-hmm. I've stolen that for com games a couple of times.
Cool.
Yeah.
Something I wanted to ask you before we get into talking about Cold City directly, and you've touched on it a little bit there, is to just maybe talk a little bit about your style as a GM. What kind of games do you like to run? What kind of stylistic or thematic kind of things come up in your games? What do you like?
I like a lot of things, but I guess I would say, well, I said I'm a history professor, and I do like the sort of playing with history, research end of games. I get excited about settings. Setting is probably what grabs me about most games first, sort of interesting settings, cool settings that I haven't seen before. But then what I said to you 5 years ago is a good answer too. I like games where the player's decisions make a difference, and I think I've got setting. I think I'm pretty good at it, and I think I got that down. What I'm interested in now, the two directions I'm interested in sort of pushing myself now are, one, the acting improv chops side of things, which you guys are so good at, pushing to dramatic emotional places and making that real and doing that in real time. And then I'm also, the kind of puzzle side of me, as the Cold City game shows, I'm interested in pushing what you can do sort of with the structure of narrative. Flashbacks, flash forwards, unreliable narrators, all these kinds of things that I was playing around with in this game. That's cool and exciting to me to sort of figure out, well, what kind of stories can't you tell in role-playing?
Cool.
So, shall we talk about Cold City?
Sounds like we're coming around to it.
Mm-hmm. So where do you want to start?
Maybe just tell us a little bit about what the game is initially, and then we can get into what you did with it.
Yeah, sure thing. So Cold City is a game by Malcolm Craig, another indie game, came out maybe 4 or 5 years ago, maybe more. And I mean, I think it's just got one of the drop-dead most awesome premises for a game. It's about Cold War monster hunters in post-World War II Berlin. So the players are a team, an international team. This is at the height of Cold War paranoia. The players are an international team consisting of, there will be a Russian on each team, an American on each team, someone from France, someone from England, someone from Germany on each team. And they are in the divided, occupied city of Berlin in 1949, 1950. They are tasked with hunting down and containing the remnants of all the black science and black magic and creepy, occult, extra-dimensional stuff that the Nazis were playing around with during the war.
So Hellboy.
It is very Hellboy. It's absolutely, Hellboy is clearly one of the influences, and Hellboy is one of the things that grabbed me and took me into the game. Yeah.
But of course our game in particular was not especially Hellboy. That's
true. One of the other really cool things about Cold City as written is this question of trust. It's almost like paranoia. The PCs always are, they come from different nations. They don't trust each other at the beginning of the game. They have conflicting agendas. Every character has a personal agenda, something that they want to accomplish, and a national agenda, something that their masters want them to accomplish. And both of those are liable to be at odds with the goals of the group as a whole. There's this complexity of shifting loyalties and trust and mistrust that you maybe don't see in Hellboy.
And one of the interesting things about the way it does trust is, when we kept this mechanic through all the different variations of systems we went through, is that it's hard to gain and it's easy to lose, right? Like, that's one of the core things. You can only take your trust up in someone else very slowly. You can lose it all in one night.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the trust mechanic actually came from another indie game. I mean, it's in Cold City. It resembles very much the mechanic in a game called The Mountain Witch. As you say, you rank how much you trust each of the other players, and you can slowly increase that, and you can very quickly decrease it. And that mechanic, it works two ways. So if I trust Bill 3 points, when Bill wants to help me, that's a bonus to me. I get those 3 points as a bonus to my roll. But when Bill wants to betray me, he gets those 3 points against me.
And also, if you don't trust Bill, even though he may be actually trustworthy in this case, it's actually a liability when you get his help.
Absolutely.
Although I think that's we tweaked that a little bit in the hack we ended up using.
Yeah, that's right.
Because I don't think in the core system it actually would be a liability.
It might not. That's right. It wouldn't strictly be a liability. It would just be a +1. It would be, but it would be clearly you get more effective, and the scale of the game is such that maxed out trust has a really big mechanical advantage. I don't think anyone ever did max out their trust in our game, which tells you something. But if you're trying to game the system and min-max the system, the way to win is for everybody to immediately trust one another with their lives until someone betrays you.
Mm-hmm. I don't know what anyone's talking about. I was totally trustworthy. Or I was perfectly upfront about the fact that you couldn't actually trust me.
Yeah, great.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah.
So as we've kind of insinuated, it was a bit of a mishmash of systems. So why don't we talk a little bit about what we did? I mean, one of the first things when we sat down to do creation, we used the Smallville creation mechanic.
Yeah, for no other reason than it seemed really neat. It seemed really cool. And without describing the whole process, you draw out a relationship map, and at the end of an hour or two of talking and half playing, you have a really elaborate relationship map connecting all the players, connecting them to half a dozen interesting non-player characters, and a lot of built-in story all ready to go. Then, as you say, the game ended up being a bit of a Frankenstein of different things. One, the game was just a long time in gestation, both from, as you all know, I've been talking about running this game for years before I did, and then even when we started, just the way scheduling works, it was extended, it was stretched out. We had character generation, a month or two went by, we had our first session, time went by. So it was stretched out over a long period of time. Yeah, things changed. One thing that happened about midway through the prep stage, right around the time the game was starting, was I got a hold of Ken Height's, I bought an advanced copy of Ken Height's game, Night's Black Agents, which is a fantastic game. It uses the gumshoe system. It's a game about spies and vampires, modern-day spies and vampires. The Bourne Identity with vampires is his elevator pitch.
Goes without saying, but I think you're a big fan of Ken Hite, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And he's, you want to talk about influences on my play style, definitely sort of influences on my GMing style, the kind of setting-heavy, dense, rich, research-based, real-world with a twist settings that he loves are things that I love too. And if that game had come out 6 months earlier, probably we'd be sitting here talking about our Night's Black Agents game instead of our Cold City game. Which is not to say that I didn't really like Cold City. By the time that game came out, I had committed in my head to the Cold City premise and setting, immediate post-war era, and I think that's an awesome setting, and I'm glad we did stick with that. But a lot of Night's Black Agents found its way into the game. A lot of, not the rules, but Ken is just so good on setting creation, campaign structure. Night's Black Agents it's a toolkit for creating a vampire conspiracy story. It doesn't define the vampire conspiracy. It gives you a zillion options for creating your own awesome vampire conspiracy. I did actually use a bunch of his examples almost right out of the box because they were so awesome. But just in terms of campaign structure and thinking about what does a spy thriller look like, that had a big impact on the game. And vampires sort of snuck in with it. I hadn't planned on vampires being in the game, but they're everywhere in Night's Black Agents, so they kind of snuck into our Berlin through the door of Night's Black Agents.
So that's what I was coming to, that you incorporated this gloss of a vampire conspiracy into the already elaborate and arcane Cold City mythos.
Yes, which maybe is not the best way to go about. There's a danger of a kitchen sinkiness of throwing more and more things in. In fact, I agonized about...
Well, yes, there were vampires, but they also weren't really vampires, so you did succeed in building into a mythology that you'd already presented.
Right. I agonized about, can I have aliens and vampires in the same game? And
It sounds so sordid when you put it that way.
you might say there's an easy solution, alien vampires. And that is what we went with. And I really worked hard to ensure, I don't know if anyone cares about this but me, but I worked hard to ensure that all the weirdness had one source. So the same thing, the aliens, the vampires, the black magic, the monsters, they all were the same thing in the end. They all came from the same black rocks that fell down from the stars. And so sort of structurally, that was a constraint that I wanted to set on myself. It wasn't a crazy pulp world where Fu Manchu is in tossing fireballs and there's also Thor and there's also aliens and that sort of thing.
Well, it had the effect of keeping the world tight, right? Everything was related to each other.
That was the goal. That was the goal. I still felt, as I think I said, difficulties with tone, with getting the tone right. I was torn between wanting it to be pulpy, Hellboy, action-adventure, and then wanting it to be this kind of moody, spooky, who can you trust spy story. I read a lot of World War II spy novels. I love Alan Furst, who writes these very moody, atmospheric spy novels.
And certainly our play style is heavy on the drama, so we play right into that wheelhouse of the kind of heavy internal kind of stuff.
Yes, and you guys are so good at that. And so for a while, squaring that circle was a challenge. Is this a game about goofy, crazy Nazi pulp? Or is this shadowy women smoking Gauloise cigarettes in foggy streets? And I guess it kind of was both. The thing that let me square the circle was it's about trust. It's about who do you trust. It's about not trusting your partners. It's about not trusting yourself. Once we pushed into the space, once we started playing around, this wasn't the original plan, but once we started playing around with people's backstories, with people's memories, with the idea that the characters don't even know everything about their own background, then it all kind of made sense. And then I got what the vibe was, that it was about doppelgangers and mind control and aliens that look like humans and who can you trust and not Lovecraft, but Philip K. Dick sort of messing with your head.
I feel like that moment was palpable on our side of the screen too, because there was a moment playing the game where it felt like, oh, this shit just got real.
Yeah.
Like everything just sort of came together and I was like, oh shit, like what is going on?
Good. Yeah. And I can't claim that I had that planned out ahead of time. That's something that emerged out of play.
A lot of the time, being a good GM is seeing those possibilities and seizing on them when you see them.
Absolutely.
So two of the main themes, as we just sort of said, were both trust and memory. And it's interesting to me because not only were we trying to figure out how much we trusted each other, it was really a game that meant that we had to trust you a lot too, right? Because you threw our backstories up in the air regularly, that things we thought we knew about ourselves would get turned on their head episode to episode. And I really enjoyed that you kept messing with that. That really was something that required trust, not just with each other, but trusting the GM, that whatever you're going to do to my backstory, it's going to be interesting in the long run.
Yeah. Well, I'm really grateful that you guys did trust me with that and that it worked. And that's something about this group. Part of figuring out how the game was going to work was also calibrating to the way the group works. And I couldn't have done this probably with my Boston group. In fact, if anybody's listening to this, taking notes, I wouldn't hold this up as a list of things GMs should do as a rule. Changing people's backstories on them, having someone turn out to be a mind-controlled assassin when they didn't know they were, having someone think that they're looking for their daughter and then tell them, oh, actually your daughter doesn't exist, having someone discover that his name is not his real name and he's not even the person he thinks he was. That's like a recipe for unhappy players, and that sounds like all the things you're not supposed to do. That sounds like all the kind of manipulative, dysfunctional sort of GM tricks that all those indie games I was talking about before were trying to get away from. Well, we could talk about why it worked, but the first thing to say is that, yeah, you guys put a lot of trust in me, and I took it slow at first because it didn't come to me all at once. I thought, oh, what if this happened? What if I raised this idea? Let's see how it goes. And people seemed to like it. And like people's eyes lit up. As you said, it seemed like a moment where shit got real. And people didn't say, no way, man. How can you mess with my character like that? And so, okay, well, let's see if we can do this, push this a little bit further. And let's pull this thread and let's pull this thread. Yeah, it just got better and better as we went in that direction. But I think it requires a group that has a lot of trust. So you've got this great premise, I think, in Cold City, built into Cold City, digging around in the ruins of the Reich for all the terrible evil toys that have been left over. But what that means is that all the characters lived through the war. All the characters have a backstory that involves the war, and probably interesting, cool, exciting, amazing, creepy things happen to them in the war.
And in fact, you can't be on the team unless you are aware that it's supernatural, that this stuff exists.
That's right. That's right. Part of character generation is coming up with the draw, I think it's called. What is the weird moment, the thing that happened to you during the war that pulled you into the unseen, occult, black science world that these people operate in? And cool as that is, it did raise an issue for me, which is maybe I should be running a weird World War II game, because there's so much cool stuff not on the table. And the characters, we did that Smallville character generation, and we had a ton of cool things that had happened to these people. You know, I'm a big believer that backstory is fine, but you want the most awesome things in the character's life to happen on screen. You want them to happen at the table.
Agreed.
You don't want to have 20 pages of awesome backstory that never comes to play. So figuring out how to deal with that backstory, I got interested in, I've run games with flashbacks many times, but they tended to be just forms of exposition. We flash back, and because we already know where the character ends up, there's not a lot of wiggle room in what's going to play out. We learn something about their past, an NPC gives a speech, we get some important information, and then we go forward. But I was watching Lost, of all things, and interested in how in Lost, I only actually kept up with Lost for the first couple of seasons. In the early seasons of Lost, certainly, often the dynamic was there's the storyline going on the island, but we're also meeting the characters and having these flashbacks, these interesting flashbacks that reveal interesting things about the characters that really play with us and play with our expectations of the characters. So I was wondering, can we do that in a game? And what I wanted to do then was to have flashbacks in-game, but have those flashbacks not decide what was going to... have those flashbacks be real play that could lead to multiple outcomes. And that meant you couldn't know what your character's backstory was. It meant that I couldn't know what your character's backstory was. I wanted to have flashbacks where we really discovered what happened to Colin's character in Berlin during the war. I wanted to have flashbacks where we really discovered what was going on with Megan's character and when she was betrayed in the French Resistance. So that meant playing with time, and it meant playing with memory. That what made it possible to do that was somewhere along the way got the idea that the antagonists have the power to screw with your mind. And there's a bunch of mind-altering, memory-altering powers for the vampires in Night's Black Agents. It's one of the options there. And so that clicked with me. And once I saw that, we have an in-game reason for the players to have amnesia, for the players to have false memories, which again is another one of these things that's so easily abused by a GM to mess around with players' memories. But it let us run a game, it let us play a game where we were all finding out what's going to happen in 1949, but we were also, when it worked, finding out for the first time what happened in 1938, what happened in 1943, what happened in 1946. And that was really cool and interesting.
And you found a lot of different, I think, variations on that. Colin's character was an English spy who found out that his name was not even his name, and we don't really know who he originally was. And Bill's character was a Russian soldier who might have been a Manchurian candidate. And in my case, my character, we suddenly revealed that no one else remembered her daughter. So was her daughter ever really there, or did everyone else have amnesia except me? So you found a lot of neat variations on memory to play with in that too.
Yeah, I wanted it to be different and crafted for each character. I didn't want it to just be a cheat, though. If you sort of forced me, I could explain how it all works, how the sort of science of how the memory changing works. I did think about that, and I didn't just say, I can do anything with memory. I did think about this villain has this power, these guys have this lesser power. I did think about those things. John, the one member of our group who's not here, he always cares about how things work, and I think that he sort of kept me honest. I was like, John's going to want to know, how come I remember this, but Megan remembers this? And so I did think about it.
Yeah, and he probably had the most complex there in that his character was actually sort of unstuck in time, and none of his memories were linear.
Yeah.
In addition, he had a second personality that was acting independently of him.
That's right.
That's right. That was his idea. That was a whole other level of complexity that I maybe wouldn't have decided on, but sure, we ran with it.
Something I have to ask you. You brought up Lost a moment ago. And I also noticed that you said that you only watched Lost for a couple of seasons. So I have to ask, were you worried that, like Lost, this enormous pile of secrets and big reveals and toying around with your audience's expectations was going to come crashing down around your ears. Did you have any sort of cold sweats in the middle of the night wondering what was going to happen?
Yeah, pretty much constantly. Pretty much for the last 15 months, constantly. Running this game was karma for all the shit I've talked about Lost over the years. Because what I wanted to do was to do what they did, play around with, run a story where you're simultaneously learning the present, learning the past, having lots of reveals. And the pacing required not just one big reveal. You can't just, it doesn't work to build up for 8 months to one big reveal. Really, once I hit my stride, I was trying to have a big reveal every night. I mean, a big reveal every session, or a medium-sized reveal every session. Sometimes those reveals were fake and double fake, like this seems to be this case, and no, actually it isn't this case, but nevertheless, trying to always keep changing the game. And I think that's how they wrote Lost, is that they just were like, well, what would blow people's minds right now? Well, what would blow people's minds this week? But yeah, there is a danger. Lost is a good example of it. You do this long enough, and suddenly you learn that there's no man behind the curtain, or it doesn't all add up, or it doesn't all make sense. At least that's my take. As I said, I never watched to the end of Lost, but my goal was to do this and still have it all be explainable at the end.
Did you have any sort of narrative balls in the air that you don't feel like you stuck the landing on at the end of the day?
There's a lot of things that got left on the cutting room floor. A lot of things that dropped out. A lot of hints that were made that didn't pay off. And a lot of hints that never got made. A lot of whole plot lines, NPCs I wish I'd used that never came into it. I think that it all actually, everything that was on screen, I keep using the screen metaphor, everything that was at the table does actually have its own internal logic. I think that I feel pretty good about that I was able to make all of that work in my own mind. By the end, we were really gunning for the climax and not slowing down for a lot of exposition. And so whether you guys got it all, that's another question. But it all makes sense to me.
Mm-hmm. If I can jump back a little bit to talking about player memory and jumping around, something I thought was interesting was it puts us occasionally in the position as players where we'll do a scene about one issue, then jump back in time and give context to that scene, and it turns out our motivation was in fact completely different than we thought it was in that scene, which occasionally made for some interesting moments where I started shooting at another member of the party, and at the time it seemed like it was probably for the sake of, I'll just say love and not explain it too much more than that, but we flash back, and then it later turned out my motivation may have actually had more to do with raising a Dark Lord.
Sure.
Or at least that was a factor.
Yeah. Or there was the very direct one where it seemed like we'd all been brainwashed some way and knew where we had to go the next day, and then it turned out, I think the next session, that my character had actually masterminded that whole thing. The other two actually had little clues planted in their brain, but my character knew exactly what she was doing. It was just faking having amnesia, and I liked that. That was a nice twist.
Mm-hmm. Or it seems like your character, Bill, maybe knew the whole time that Baba Yaga was out in the wilderness of Russia.
Maybe.
Yeah, and that was awesome. The Baba Yaga stuff, my God, that was so good.
But we did end up with these interesting moments where you have to rethink the scenes that you previously did in this new light. I don't know, role-playing is different than TV in that in TV you don't know what a character is thinking inside their head. But in role-playing you do, or you can at least, depending on the type of player you are. And so you can have these interesting moments where it's like, oh, that's not what I was thinking at the time. But turns out, reality's more complex than I thought it was.
I think it always worked for me because it either seemed to come directly out of something about my character that felt true, or it was way more awesome than what I was thinking in my head. And so it was easy to go, yeah, sure, I masterminded that. That was absolutely me.
Mm-hmm.
That's good. This doesn't solve the problem. What you're describing is another example of trust that you guys put in me and things that I asked you to run with that you did a great job running with. I did my best never to require you to feel a certain way about anything. And so often what my prep was, well, how will they react to this? What will they think about this? If I change this, I didn't know which way people's loyalties would go. Is your character, Colin, is Edward going to stay loyal to his mentor in the British Secret Occult Service or not? And how much can I push on that, and how much is he going to resent that? And I would come up with what was going to happen, but not how you're going to feel about it.
Right. Well, I don't think I ever really ran into a situation where I felt like I was betraying my own character, or betray a scene where there was something emotional happened that I really liked, and then later that turned out never to be true because I was actually thinking something else at the time and just conning somebody. Never ran into that kind of situation, which maybe suggests that you were aware of the emotional stakes that were happening in certain scenes and aware of what things maybe you could change and what things you couldn't.
Yeah, that's a good point. I should say another reason this worked for this group, I think, is that the payoff, there's lots of things that make a session good, but one of the things that you and we really like and really drive for is emotional, dramatic scenes. Big confrontations, big sort of dramatic interactions. You guys are really good at that. And here, we're going back to Lost, because I don't know how many times I scoffed at what I thought was a flimsy defense of Lost, saying, well, the plot stopped making sense 3 seasons ago, but I watched it for the characters, right? But
some of us are still defenders of that show.
Sure, well, so anyway, you could say that, maybe if you were being uncharitable, you could say that about Cold City. You could say, the plot doesn't totally add up, but I watched it for the characters. And I found I was watching it, enjoying it for the characters.
Lock your keys in the house next door and attach your favorite things to the bathroom floor. And as you're waiting for the sink,
I talked before about how much got left on the cutting room floor. A lot of it was subtraction. Well, I don't need that. Really, I have this crazy idea about clockwork doomsday device under Berlin, but what people want to see is Yuri and Talia, and what people want to see is Eddie and Cornwall, and people want to see how Cecile is going to interact with, the sort of men in her life, people. Again, I'm talking like there's an audience. The audience is us, but that if those scenes worked and if those scenes landed, I didn't want to cheat on the mechanics of the plot, but I realized that wasn't as important as the drama character scenes.
But you still used it in a lot of ways to facilitate the drama. So it's not like we completely avoided it. It's
Yeah, absolutely. I was talking before about my Boston group and the games I ran there. And Bill's blog is titled High Trust, High Drama. And that's a great name for the style that I think we try to play in. A lot of my earlier games would be medium trust, high cleverness, where it's not that we didn't like drama, but the thing that drove us, the thing that I wanted to impress people with, the thing that people were playing for, was the ingenuity of the setting. We were reading a lot of Ken Hite. We read all the Suppressed Transmission. We had these research-heavy games. A couple of the guys that gamed with Ken. We had these research-heavy games with these really elaborate world building, and where the moment that made the game really cool, the thing that people would remember and talk about later, was when they did the library research that fit together the pieces and they discovered that the novel The Wizard of Oz describes the whole occult history of the United States and the secret civil war between gold and silver, and that their opponent is actually Dorothy from The Wizard of Oz, grown up 120 years old, and she's turned into the Wicked Witch of the West. And everyone's just like, damn, that's cool. And all these little pieces fit together, and they sort of marvel at the construction of it. And that's awesome. And that was that's my instinct, just to sort of run in that direction and build this really complicated puzzle box of a setting.
As an aside, Rob, I have always really coveted the idea of maybe you running us through an Unknown Armies game sometime. Because you've talked about that game in Boston, and it really, really makes me excited.
Well, it was a great, great, cool game. But I don't know that I could reproduce it exactly. Of course, we could use bits of it. I could run a game like it, and I would be happy to do so. But I think that, that you guys, it's not that you aren't clever yourselves, and it's not that you don't also like that stuff. But I think push comes to shove, you got to choose. People would go for another one of those great scenes, with Cecile and the Russians, and everybody's hard on their sleeve, and people pounding the emotional content really amped up. That was what we were playing for, more than how cleverly I could interweave real life history with the Hellboy mythos, or something like that.
Yeah, I probably enjoyed the scene where you and I, as the Breckhoff brothers, kind of went at each other's throats more than probably any other scene in the whole series. And there were a lot of scenes I liked.
That's actually something I wanted to ask. Did people have those moments? What were the moments that stood out? So you had...
Right. The scene where my character Yuri and his brother Gregor were going at each other very hard. I can't remember what we were arguing about, but it was fantastic.
It was about your girlfriend.
It was likely about your
Isn't it
your
always?
girlfriend. Yeah.
What about you, Colin?
I'd say that my favorite moment was probably in the finale when we had this great moment of asymmetry of information and tone between John's character and myself. I'm in a moment where I feel that I failed the city I love and the city's going to be destroyed, and, all I can do is make the city's sacrifice mean something. That's the best I can hope for. And John's character is playing the other half of this, where he is having a moment of self-sacrifice and saving the world.
Flying to the rescue in his solid gold flying Nazi saucer.
Right, and he's
Hurtling towards Berlin, that's right. In the ancient Tibetan Nazi flying saucer.
Right.
Yes, it was a super cool moment where I've totally failed in everything I've set out to do, or I feel that I have. But that character will never know that he in fact didn't.
Yeah.
What he did in fact ensured that the city survived.
Right, it was both of them that saved the world by doing that, but they didn't both know that was neat.
It was a really cool moment. Yeah.
What about you, Megan?
I think mine was kind of one of my quietest moments. I had called for a next week on that I was going to wake up from a nightmare, and I think I said you'd be interested if I was in bed with somebody. And I'd previously been given the job of seducing Bill's character's brother, Gregor, who is the head of Russian military intelligence in Berlin, so that seemed to work. And I think I like it because it confounded what I thought. I thought, I'm going to wake up and I'll answer the first 3 questions he asks. Like, that's when she's vulnerable. And somehow that scene started, and I gave away way more information than I was intending to. It was such a quiet scene, but such an intense scene, and I really enjoyed how much those 2 characters always interacted. There was always this level of, we know we can't trust each other, but we're sort of going to anyway, in the middle of the night when no one else is around. And so that the quietness of those moments really got to me.
Yeah, that was great too. There's always a danger the Russians were going to steal the show in that game. Somehow the Russian characters, player character and non-player character, if you're a Russian in 1949, you're playing for keeps. That's just kind of, the other characters were great too, but I could have run a whole game about Russians, I think.
So what about you, Rob?
Oh, wow. Well,
No pressure.
no, that's a great question. I mean, every one of those moments you guys mentioned would be on my list.
Hint, it's about my character.
Sure. I mean, every one of those moments you guys mentioned would be on my list. And then I guess I would have to say, in terms of what we were talking about before, about making the game work, the moments when it started to work and started to click. Because I don't want to be too self-congratulatory. I struggled with this game and with how it was working. And I think the sessions were all fine, but I think it took a while to find its way.
There was some growing pains before we really hit our stride, and I think we all kind of felt it, like the energy in the room changed at a certain point.
Yeah, absolutely. Just to belabor the Lost analogy one more time, I'll tell you like my least favorite kinds of scenes. Early on, it would often happen when you guys would come at an NPC for information and I wouldn't have it ready and I wouldn't know what the answers were. And the smart thing to do would be to pick something and commit, because that always works out. That works fine. But often my wrong instinct would be to stall, would be to dissemble, would be to try and get out of the conversation. And so we would have these, to me, very reminiscent of Lost conversations where someone would be demanding answers, rightfully demanding answers to a pressing situation, and some NPC would be giving lame prevarications, and you'd have these kind of meandering, you want to say something cool, but it's totally vague and meaningless. I think about poor Major Coffee, how many scenes he had that worked like that, where you guys were coming at him with like full intensity, and you're good at that, and he was shucking and jiving, not because his character was so untrustworthy, just because I didn't know what the answers were. I hadn't committed to the answers. So you asked me the best scenes. Those were the scenes that I thought, oh man, that's why this is the Lost Writers getting even with me for dumping on them. That's
instant karma.
Yeah, that's how this happens when you're trying to stall and tap dance. And it's never better to stall. It's always better to give up the information, because what would happen, I'd come home after the session and I'd never be unhappy about any information that had been given out. 9 times out of 10, I'd think, why didn't I tell them this? Why didn't I tell them that? Why didn't I put this bit of exposition on the table? Why didn't I put that bit of exposition on the table? The hard part in running a game of this kind is not keeping the secrets. It's revealing the secrets. It's getting them. It's the pipeline of information to the player.
But it can be a struggle with this type of thing to feed things out at a regular pace.
You want to feed things out at a regular pace, and you want them to be cool. And generally, if I didn't have something ready, that was just about prep. That was like, I hadn't prepped it enough. I wanted to take more time to figure out a cool way to say it, or commit to this is what the implications of this are.
Mm-hmm. There's also a thing in role-playing games, unlike movies and television, where the main character finds somebody who has answers. They can get a couple of answers out of them, and then we can find a situation by which they lose access to the person, or the guy stops responding, or the guy gets shot, or something like that, and they lose access. In a role-playing game, it's a lot harder to do that. So if I find somebody that has answers, I'm going to shake him until all the answers fall out of his jacket.
Right. Why wouldn't you?
Right. So there's that instinct to hold back a little bit is, I think, natural, but yeah.
you asked before about my favorite scenes, and I would say that the kind of intense emotional scenes that you guys described, every one of those would be on my list. The great scenes of, I love Gregor, I love the interaction between Gregor and Cecile and the interaction between Gregor and Yuri. He was great, and all those scenes were great. A different kind of scene that I really liked in the game, and this may take us back to system. Partway through, we switched system we were using the basic Cold City system, which is basically Sorcerer without demons. It's a neat enough dice mechanic, but it wasn't really working for me. It wasn't really doing anything for us. And I'm not a big rules system guy. Mostly I like the system to get out of the way. But we switched. I don't know how or why we made this choice, but we brought in leverage.
I can tell you why. We wanted to simulate the trust mechanic, and we wanted to have different levels for trust.
Yeah.
And so Cortex was an easy place to go to because it has that built in.
Had the right number of levels. It's a cool kind of system. You pointed me to, is it Rob Donahue's blog, where
Yes.
he does a lot of hacking of the system, and it seemed interesting. Anyway, without going into the whole sort of system thing, we switched partway through to leverage, which might seem like a funny mix if you say, well, this game doesn't sound an awful lot like leverage to me, but...
Well, and it wasn't.
It wasn't, but the leverage system, it's a relatively simple dice mechanic, but it generates complications, it generates sort of conflicts kind of grow more complicated the longer they go on, and the stakes rise the longer they go on, and there's movement for back and forth.
There's also a meaningful chance of failure such that there's a reason to have a conflict.
Yeah, right. So a couple of scenes that I think the system took us in excellent places. The first time we tried out the system, basically we tried it out with a car chase. And in the grand scheme of things, the car chase wasn't that important, but it was suddenly like the mechanics, the rules engine had been sort of sputtering along, and suddenly we were behind the wheel of this cool sports car and all this sort of stuff. We had this total James Bond car chase that was...
The car chase scene was a metaphor for the game itself.
Yes, absolutely. Well, that's the point when sort of things started happening. And then another kind of, not entirely system-driven, but system-based. And in some ways, we never had a conflict as complicated and convoluted as that car chase again, partly because Bill's character was the combat monster, and Bill got good enough at the system that he knew how to shut down every damn fight. So I could never make, no matter how many Nazis I threw at you, I could never make a fight last for more than one round.
Or how many superhumanly strong
Superhuman
vampires.
Yeah. The vampires maybe fought him to a draw once or twice, but that's about it. But no, the other scene I'm thinking about is the scene where Coffee died. The showdown, classic kind of Mexican standoff in the crypt of an old German castle. You're surrounded by the East Germans. They're moving in, and the relationship between Coffee and the rest of the team, especially Coffee and Yuri, has really come to a head in the last episode, and suddenly everybody's guns are out, and everybody's pointing their guns at each other. And I didn't plan this. I didn't know which way it was going to go, and it was just like you want to have happen in one of those standoffs. The NPC, in describing his dialogue, said, he turns and points his gun at Talia, this other NPC.
Yuri's girlfriend.
And my ex-girlfriend.
And Edward Collins' ex-girlfriend. And Colin interrupts me to say, I drop him. I shoot him. And he wasn't about to shoot her. He wasn't going to kill her. He was just gesturing. He was actually hoping to get her on side because he was desperate, and he thought maybe she will get Yuri, the Russian, to see reason. So the guns come out, the dice hit the table, blam, 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 and she gets shot, which of course sets Yuri off. He comes and just takes Coffee down, takes him apart, and it was just sort of one of these, you couldn't engineer that. It was time, it was late enough in the series that Coffee could go, and you couldn't engineer that sort of standoff, and the way in which a standoff like that is going to, go off in some unexpected, terrible direction, and it's going to lead to, all the stuff is going to blow up, but not in a way you expect, and that was just really satisfying and awesome. And then the vampire lord emerged from his crypt.
That was gut-wrenching for me because I had a relationship with Coffee all the way through the series. I had tried to be a friend to him, and we had sometimes come close to that, but we had our conflicts, and we were starting to sort of drift apart again at the end. But then, because I didn't deal with him in a more permanent manner earlier or take him out of the game, my lover gets shot, and as far as I know, she's dead at that point.
Yeah.
So that was just a very powerful moment for me and for my character.
Right. No, and of course, Yuri had to react that way. Another thing that was neat about that is this game about trust. You have this team of 5 investigators, 4 of whom are PCs, 1 of whom is the NPC. Well, who do you think is going to betray the party? Who are people going to be suspicious of? So of course,
Well, betrayal had happened before.
there was all sorts of little betrayals. That's right, and there were plenty of people who could betray the team, and everyone got betrayed in little ways. But I'm sure you guys were waiting for the shoe to drop and the big reveal that Coffee was a Nazi, a vampire, in league with the whatever, and basically he was what he said he was all along, and
He was suspiciously normal.
he was suspiciously normal, and that was his undoing in the end. But just that it played out, and he, I think he was in his own way trying to save Yuri, trying to save the team, trying to help the team. That was what was great. Was it wasn't just I am actually the villain who has been playing you all along. Simply by running straight along the character that he had always been, he came into implacable conflict with Yuri and the rest of the team.
And ended up without a head. It was
Ended
gross.
up without a head.
And actually, that scene might segue into another topic that, in the moment, Coffee was trying to point out, none of this makes sense. What we're doing, this organization, what we're doing here, none of this makes sense. And that was something you talked earlier about. You struggled with yourself, that the agency itself makes no sense.
Yeah.
And you wanted to address it within the game.
Yeah, that's right. So I talked before about struggling with tone.
And before you go on, I'll point out Coffee got shot for talking about this, so watch yourself.
Right. I talked before about struggling with tone. Also, I struggled with, verisimilitude, which is a funny thing to say in a game with flying saucers and mind control and vampires, but it started to bug me that, it seems like a great premise. You have a Russian, an American, and an Englishman all working together, forced to work together on this team to find this secret Nazi tech. But why would the Russians work with the Americans and vice versa? If I wanted to amp up the tension of the Cold War, it quickly made no sense that this organization would exist at all. So what do you do with that? You can just hand wave it, I guess, and sort of say, it exists in this world, and it's just the thing you have to swallow. Or, because I was wrestling with that, trying to figure it out, and wondering, what happens when the players start asking that question? I started to make that one of the big mysteries that the players had to figure out. Okay, something is obviously going on, and that's, I think, that I've done before. That, I think, I don't know who gave me that advice originally, but if there's something about the setting, about the setup, about the situation that doesn't make sense, make that the mystery, make that the story, make that the grid of sand that irritates you, and make that the thing around which you wrap your pearl. So as people start to dig into that, why are they working together? What does that mean? Then the setting itself, the problems with the setting actually become the cool features of the setting that you're working to cover.
I just heard the great screenwriter Chris McQuarrie tell a very similar story about Jack Reacher, his Tom Cruise movie there a couple of years ago.
Yeah, it probably is screenwriting advice. It's good storytelling advice. I think if you have this question, you can hope that people just won't notice it, pay no attention, do some razzle-dazzle and look the other way, and that works sometimes. But yeah, if it's really bugging you, then make that the question that has to be solved, or make that one of the questions that has to be solved.
To steer you a little bit back towards, we started talking about the leverage rules and how that impacted the game. You talked a little bit about how sometimes was my character's thing that he was so competent that sometimes it was difficult to put a challenge in front of him that he couldn't deal with almost immediately. There's something built into the Cortex Plus system where if you beat the challenge number by a certain amount, it ends right away. A lot of people have described leverage as a game as competency porn. Right, it's all about sort of being the best you are at what you do. Was that a problem for you? Did that create challenges for you in throwing things Yuri's way? I know that eventually you turned that around in the last episode and put me in a situation where I had a fight I couldn't win.
Yeah.
What did that do to your game on your side of the screen?
Yeah, so one side effect of changing systems was suddenly, and without any in-game explanation, all the players got way more competent at what they were good at, especially at what they were best at. Because in leverage system as written, when people are in their wheelhouse doing the thing that they're good at, they're really damn good. And it is kind of competency porn in that it's fun to watch the leverage team be awesome and be awesome in their various ways. And the system isn't really so much about success and failure. It's about complications and opportunities. It's about the sort of interesting, funny, scary, suspenseful, unexpected things that happen in the middle of a conflict. And that all is cool. But yeah, it's true. The team was, when they were each doing their thing, they were all really effective. That didn't bother me too much.
Well, you did express frustration a couple of times that
Yeah.
your sort of big, sinister vampires seem to always get their asses handed to them.
Well, yeah, sure, that's true. if I would sit down with the mechanics and maybe prep a little better, I could always have just increased the dice and done something like that. So partly it was just my lackadaisical prep. I was just guessing, okay, these guys will be 2 10-sided dice or whatever.
It does seem like there's a real economy in Cortex Plus.
There is an economy.
I know we were sort of figuring it out.
We were figuring it out, and I think again, if you read, Rob Donahue's blog, I think that like someone who knows that system can make it sing in all sorts of really cool ways, and there's lots of things you can do with it. I did sometimes grumble about how Yuri was unstoppable in combat, but that just became part of the storyline, that Yuri was unstoppable in combat. Mm-hmm. That was an aspect of his character.
Except for that one time that I tried to throw a grenade at someone.
Early on, that's right. And we had to come up with an in-game explanation for that because it was so bizarre that he hadn't won. So we were like, oh, that tells us something about Hans. How is it possible that he caught the grenade, right? That actually was part of his time dilation and that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I always treated Hans with a lot more respect after that moment.
It was also the case with Yuri that even though he was a combat monster, you tended to roll large die pools. And so although you always won your conflict, you almost always generated complications as a result, which was sort of an interesting way of resolving violence in that setting. Oftentimes solved the immediate problem, but it created a cascading issue.
Yeah.
That's true.
Yeah.
Although I think towards the end of the game, I was really rolling hot, and there was just nothing in my way that I couldn't cut through. As soon as I had Talia by my side, I was just rolling through the roof every time.
You almost killed the father of my character's child before I had the chance to, which was the job that Rob gave me by the end of the game. To get my daughter back, I had to kill the man I loved.
Right.
Well, and these things are more or less true about all of our characters, right? Like your character, Megan, there was basically nobody that you couldn't get information out of or con if you wanted to.
Yeah.
Nobody could hide information in records from me.
Hans could pretty much make any technology work.
Right, and like by the end of the game had in fact made an atomic weapon.
One issue I maybe had with the system and with this sudden boost in everybody's competence is that Yuri's competence in combat was a lot more visible than the other characters. Each had their own thing. We hacked the standard Cortex stats in homage to John le Carré. We called them Tinker, Talker, Soldier, Spy, Thief. And Yuri had the D10 in Soldier, and so, he was the combat machine. Cecile was the talker, the trickster, the person who could flatter and seduce and lie better than anyone else. Edward was the master spy, both classic intelligence, but also he was an occultist and a magician and a wizard. And my conception of the characters was that each one of them was in their own sphere just as awesome and over-the-top cool as Yuri was in his sphere. But some of those things are harder to get on screen, harder to make concrete and obvious than combat. Combat is the classic thing that happens in every session, or so often happens.
Especially as the game is starting to reach its resolution, and you're doing less talking, less trying to find information, less tinkering with objects and building machines. Conflicts start being resolved, and oftentimes how they resolve is people punching each other in the face.
Yes. Yeah, so, if I had a regret about it, it would be nice to have figured out, there were some good scenes where these things happened, but it would be nice to have figured out some equivalent set pieces, right? Equivalent sort of like, okay, this is going to be a great big combat, we're going to have all these Russians and Yuri's going to kick ass. Like, what would the equivalent set piece for Cecile be? What is the use of her trickster ability that is going to be as dramatic and play out in a sort of a way that also shows us, there's nobody like Cecile when it comes to this.
You almost have to do sort of an elaborate Ocean's 11 kind of con, right?
Right.
Or infiltration scene in her case, perhaps.
Sure.
Well, it was definitely the case early on that we started with missions. We would go out and do missions. And as the game went on, and this seems to be the case with every role-playing game we play, even when we start with that premise that we're going to go out and do missions, that we drift away from that and we start dealing with, the big shit that's happening in the game setting, and we have less of these day-to-day jobs that we have to do.
Yeah, when I ran Shadowrun, whenever we tried to do an actual run, the game ground to a halt and it wasn't any fun.
Mm-hmm. But anytime we dealt with the bigger issues going on at play, it was fantastic.
The soap opera, the relationships,
exactly.
I thought, the structure of an RPA, of the group, the agency, the Cold City, every week you start with a briefing, right? They get a briefing, they're going to be in a dark room with a slide projector, someone's going to show them some pictures of the corpses that they found.
You even had me do little presentations a couple of times.
That's right. I wanted, trying to mix it up, think about different ways to do the classic briefing, thought, okay, what if the character gives the briefing, because that'll happen in story. That'll happen in fiction, right? Is that
That's
the
a good way
characters
of
themselves will
reinforcing.
brief one another. Yeah, briefings are like such great concentrated exposition. Every Hellboy comic starts with one of these scenes where we have a page or two of the manila folders and the slide projector, and we learn all the exposition we need to know before they set off. I don't know why we didn't get into the pattern of doing that. Sometimes I thought it was just because I was too lazy to write the briefings.
Well, I've been thinking recently that something that seems to happen in these games is as soon as your character's issue's on the table and you're given the choice, well, you have your scene choice now. You can either go chase after this week's monster or you can go deal with your personal stuff. You're always going to pick going and dealing with your personal stuff. I've been trying to think recently about, well, how does this work in TV? What usually seems to happen is the character will go and have the conversation that they need to have, and in doing so, they find out something about what is actually going on, about the monster of the week.
Yeah.
And there's a trick there in figuring out how to do that in this type of game or any type of game, how to create those situations. But that seems to be the way to do it, because otherwise you're always going to drift away from it.
Right.
I think the other thing that came up in this game, and we didn't remark on it very much as the game unfolded, was that the game in real time, in the setting, only unfolded over the course of, I think, a week or two. You know, even though it was 15 months of playtime, you know, like it was just a handful of days, right? So we really didn't have that much time to go running missions around the ruins of Berlin, you know? Like we had our serious stuff happening, and it came to a boil very quickly.
Yeah, I think there was that one time where you actually just say, this time, unlike every other time, a couple of days are going to pass between episodes as opposed to starting right where we left off.
Yeah.
You could totally handle that by having the restraint on the game that each week is a distinct episode and putting a restraint that, like, yes, you can call for a scene that's about your thing, but you also have to deal in some way with this other thing that's happening.
Yeah, but we were ending on such good cliffhangers. You had to start right where that ended.
And it's what that game was. And
Yeah.
I'm not going to say that shouldn't be what the game is, but you could probably create a situation where you force time to go ahead.
That was another sort of stylistic choice, not that I fell into, but I've been watching the Bourne Identity movies. And I don't know if you remember that they do a neat thing with time where the third Bourne Identity movie actually begins about halfway through the second Bourne Identity movie, or the second Bourne movie, and the two movies are actually happening at the same time. And then the fourth movie, which is sort of outside the trilogy, doesn't have Matt Damon, it's not as good, but it's still got some cool ideas. The fourth movie happens during number 2 and 3 also. So they're all kind of overlapping on one another in this kind of like, you know, there's no downtime. They're just pounding on each other. And so that idea of amping up the pressure by having no downtime did appeal to me. So we did have a run of maybe 6 episodes, which, you know, took us 8 months to play, where there was no downtime between sessions, where we started immediately after, or in sometimes backed up. We had to, because we were at the time, the compression was so great, I had to call for flashbacks. We were like, well, we're already in the climax, so if you want to call for a scene, call for something you did before all this happened. That was another kind of aesthetic choice that seemed neat and seemed to like ramp the pressure up, but it worked against a kind of monster of the week structure. Absolutely.
That was something else I wanted to mention, and I'd forgotten that we did the usual Primetime Adventures thing of having the players call for scenes by turns. We did that. I don't think we did it consistently, but there's built right into the rules in Leverage, there is a certain amount of control for players to be able to declare that they have done things in the past, right? And to introduce facts into the game as being true. And I know that we didn't do that all that much, but I think that you had actually put it on the table for us that it was something that we could do to kind of state a truth about what was going on in the story, you know, like to sort of give us a hand on the tiller a little bit, although you sort of held a lot of cards.
Yeah, maybe it was an unfair thing to ask. I thought, well, okay, the past, as we said, the future is undetermined and so is the past. There's lots of stuff we don't know about these characters' backstories, so there's plenty of room for you to assert things that happened in their past. Well, actually, I meant to do this. Well, all along I've been planning this. Well, secretly I buried this thing here. And Leverage has a good system for that, for those kinds of, well, actually I knew this all along, sort of scenes and moments. And so I assumed and thought we would do more of that. And it happened a few times. It happened a little bit. But you guys didn't really dive into that. And I think that I could ask you why that might be. I suspect that maybe it was asking a lot for you to jump in and make declarations about the past when I had hidden so much of the past from you that you just didn't have the tools, weren't equipped to sort of say, well, this is what I was planning.
I know for me, I would run into situations where, to some degree, it's important for me to be true to who my character is internally. my character's internal life. And so when I'd run into a situation where I thought my character was genuinely surprised, it made it weird to go back and say, oh, my character wasn't actually genuinely surprised. I had actually planned for this all along. And it feels in some way that I'm being untrue to who the character is if I do that it decreases the emotional resonance of the actual surprise moment. There were a couple situations where it made sense to do that kind of thing, like when we were in the German castle and I made a retcon or an insertion, I guess, that I had put a trap sigil upstairs at this weird table that things would come back to life, but most of the time I didn't find those situations made sense.
Maybe the difference is that in Leverage, it's a genre that is all about the heroes of the story really being in control, the masters of the universe, and for us, a lot of the drama was about the sort of the uncertainty, the not being able to grasp fully what's going on, and sort of being in the moment, being lost.
Yeah, that's right.
And I personally just sometimes have trouble coming up with stuff off the top of my head. I think I'm really good at reacting to things people throw at me, but I'm not always good at coming up with entirely new ideas myself.
Yeah, your reveals were so good, too. At a certain point, like, I kind of felt like, what am I going to come up with that's as good? I can't think of anything, so.
It's nice of you to say. But I sort of thought, if Yuri says, actually, I killed my way out of Matryoshka, the mind control program, I'll run with that. I'll say, okay, you did. And if Edward says, well, I only let myself be captured by the Germans so I could pass them this misinformation, I'd be like, excellent, cool. But hey, I'm happy with how it played out.
So that's our discussion about Cold City, and we hope that maybe you got some interesting ideas, things to think about from that discussion, and hopefully we weren't too long-winded, and hopefully there weren't too many character stories in it, or at least that they were interesting.
Thanks for being on the show, Rob. We hope to play in many of your exciting games in the future.
Thanks for indulging me both in this long conversation and also in the game, and thank you guys for just being awesome. It was the game was awesome because of all of you.
There's a fire that's fueling in the workplace as it describes an old friend's fall from grace. You can't just go, get up and leave. My hands remain ingrained in your history. Avoiding plans to go for coffee with the skylark.
So now we're going to hit one of our regular segments, our segments on inspirations. And some of us today are going to talk about inspirations that relate to this game. I'm not sure if all of us will, but Megan, why don't you start? What's your inspiration this week?
Since we're going with the Cold City theme, I thought I'd go with the weird thing that got me to my character, oddly, which was actually a Doctor Who episode. Back from the Christopher Eccleston season, there's that one called The Empty Child, where it's the Blitz in London, and there's the little child going around the gas mask, and the mother who never admitted that was her son. And to me, that was, for some reason, that resonated, the idea that having a child during the war and never acknowledging the child then suddenly turned into a mother who'd lost her child in the war and had spent 7 years looking for her. So it was the Empty Child episode of Doctor Who was pretty much my inspiration for Cecile.
And that was a creepy as hell episode.
It was.
I haven't seen it. I'll have to check it out.
That was probably one of the most iconic episodes in
It's
new
the first
run
one
of
with
Doctor Who.
Captain Jack. It's awesome for that reason, too.
My inspiration is Graham Walmsley's Cthulhu Dark, a great mini-game that maybe improves on the already almost flawless Call of Cthulhu rule set. It's a page and a half of total awesome that you should all check out. It's available online free. Graham Walmsley, if you don't know him already, wrote a really great book on using improvisational techniques and role-playing called Play Unsafe, which our guest Rob introduced me to, and it's a really terrific book. Cthulhu Dark very much follows in some of the ideas that you find in Play Unsafe. Even if you like Call of Cthulhu, you should really check this out. Of course, you can't call it Cthulhu Light, it's Cthulhu Dark.
I thought I'd mention, when I was prepping for this game, I had done research into, I'd originally planned to play a Russian character, and weirdly Bill and I came to the table with the same character concept, so I didn't end up playing that character. But something that was really cool, which you guys should check out, is Dan Carlin's Hardcore History podcast. There's a bunch of episodes in there called Ghosts of the Ostfront, which talks about the Battle of Stalingrad and all of the lead up to, the events of, and the aftermath of. And I didn't end up using any of it, but it's all really good and totally worth listening to.
What about you, Rob?
Well, here's where I demonstrate that I'm a history professor, because I'm going to give you all lots of reading to do. Beyond the influences on Cold City that we've already mentioned, Hellboy and BPRD, Ken Height's awesome Knights Black Agents, Malcolm Craig's original game, the Bourne Identity movies, the spy novels of Alan First, 3 books that found their way into the game. Catherine Valenti's novel Deathless, which is a great magic realism novel about Russian folklore overlaid onto the very scary actual history of Russia in the 20th century. And so Baba Yaga, who came into the last act of our game in a big way, the portrayal of Baba Yaga came straight out of Deathless, and lots of other just excellent kinds of mashup of cool Russian folklore, which is really cool, with scary Soviet history. Another fantasy/history novel is Ian Tregillis, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, a novel, Bitter Seeds, which is the first of a trilogy. I've only read the first book, but basically it's a World War II novel about British warlocks versus Nazi supermen during World War II, and it's a lot of fun.
Damn.
Yeah, a lot of Edward's backstory is embedded in that book, or comes stolen from that book. And then an actual history book, Alexander Ritchie's Faust's Metropolis, is this awesome history of Berlin, like 800-year history of Berlin. It's a great big book. It's 800 pages and it covers centuries, but it moves along like you're reading a pulp novel. It's incredibly readable, and if this game had ended up being a sort of Ken Height style, research-heavy, here's the whole secret history of Berlin, here's how Attila the Hun and the Roman Empire and the Kaiser and the Prussians all connect up to Hitler and the Nazi occult and everything else, then there would have been a lot more of that book in it, because it's just a terrific and very, as I said, readable and powerful history of this incredible city that's been at the center of so much of European and world history.
Fantastic.
Okay, so this week we've got...
the episode The Empty Child from the Christopher Eccleston season of Doctor Who.
Cthulhu Dark by Graham Walmsley.
Ghosts of the Ostfront from Dan Carlin's Hardcore History Podcast.
2 novels, Deathless by Catherine Valenti and Bitter Seeds by Ian Tregillis, and a nonfiction history, Faust's Metropolis by Alexandra Ritchie.
And that's all for this special episode of Shake, Rattle, and Roleplay. We'll see you all next time.
If we mean love, then I'll hold you.
Thanks for listening. For more Shake, Rattle, and Roleplay, drop by our Facebook page.
Softest pitch to the hardest break of dawn.
We'd love to hear from you if you have any questions, comments, or ideas for stuff you'd like to hear on the show. Email us at shakerpg@gmail.com or follow us on Twitter at shakerpg.
With both my arms. If we mean love.
Music on our show was kindly provided by Little City, a great Canadian band you guys should totally check out. You can buy their album on iTunes or visit them online at littlecityband.com.
Mine. And practice calm and cool through troubled times. If I mean love, then I'll hold you up to the sky.
I don't know if I have anything more to say on that topic.
It's good.